Mukalian. I am a cross-solutions workload technical architect. My primary workload, however, is modern work, and that's part of today's discussion. So with me today is Mr. Todd Furst.
Great, thanks, Mike. My name is Todd Furst. I'm the Chief Technical Architect here at the Philadelphia MTC. And Mike and I have been doing this session for several years with customers. We really enjoy doing it because it usually brings together the identity team, the collaboration team, the risk management team. Everyone needs to get in on why they can and how can they enable guest access securely according to what they need to do. So let's jump into it. Today, what we're going to look at on the agenda, as far as first we want to kick off, is why are we doing this session? What are customers trying to achieve? Why have they come to us to discuss this piece? And then before we get into the details, we just want to level set around the Azure AD guests, because there's a few options and how they can be used in different types. And then there's three key governance patterns that we're going to get into. And really, we're going to spend most of the time on the bottom two here, but we will cover the first one out of the box as well. Before we get into that, though, just one takeaway is with all the customers we've worked with, they're usually larger enterprise customers, highly regulated, and they usually have very unique needs, even though there's some really common patterns that we've seen across those customers. And so when they come into the Microsoft Technology Center, we listen to what they need and then design that solution specifically for them. The reason why we wanted to put the map up is we really want to understand if you have questions and want to go deeper after this session, please reach out to your account team so they can get you hooked into one of the global technology centers and have this discussion with them. All right, so let's get into it. So what are the key reasons we're having this session? The first piece is really we've had multiple customers over several years blocking guest access because they really want to understand it in depth before they turn it on, and they needed all the governance and compliance around it that met their needs before they enabled it as well. So when I say that security teams don't trust B2B guest accounts, I agree with them. They should keep them off until they get it to the level that they need, and that's what we help them do. So we'll kind of walk through what that means in detail. And then a completely second part of this is how do we drive collaboration at scale? So it's one thing to bring guests in one at a time and send out some invites. It's another to say, hey, maybe we had a merger and acquisition and we need to bring in 100 or 1,000 or maybe 10,000 people at scale and get them the same access as in groups. So maybe it's a finance department, maybe it's HR, and do that very programmatically. And we see that in many scenarios, maybe multi-tenant, might be a merger and acquisition, could just be working very close with a partner as well. Overall, just what we're going to talk about, the B2B guest accounts are really the foundation of all key collaboration inside of Microsoft 365. So it's not just Teams, it's SharePoint, it's anything else you can think of. So let's level set what we're going to focus on today, because even the term guest has a lot of meaning to it. So to put things in context, we like to just level set with customers. First, we draw a nice big oval and say, hey, here's your tenant sitting here. And maybe you have a test dev tenant. Maybe you have other tenants. Maybe you're a holding company with several different tenants. Maybe you just had a merger and acquisition. So now you have multiple tenants either way. So we kind of put that in the circle of trust there. And so in this case, you really want to collaborate at a high level between these different tenants, and there's a high level of trust. And then we bring in what we call partner tenants. So these are people you work with. Maybe there's a contract in place, and for X amount of years, you're going to be working very closely with them as well. And the difference is they're just not part of your company, but you're going to work very closely with them and maybe at scale as well. So a high level of trust. Not as high as inside the oval, but that very high level of trust, that high level of collaboration is needed as well. Still need governance, still need all the pieces that are key to this as well. And then the last piece, which I just called guest tenants, this is everyone else. They don't fit into the other two buckets, so they're just the other bucket that's out there. We might not be as programmatic with them, but we still need to cover them. And also like to cover this out. Sometimes I'll scratch out the word tenants. They don't have to be Azure Active Directory tenants with Office 365 capabilities. It could just be a company that runs their own infrastructure entirely. They're not really leveraging cloud. We can still work with them across the board. That's kind of the first piece of level setting. The second one is when we say the term guest, there's a lot of different meanings to it as Microsoft continually invests in that capability. So in general, we're talking about, at a high level, external identities. And the one we're going to focus on today is around what's called B2B collaboration, which is, if we use the term B2B or guest, this is the one that's been around the longest. And that means we can federate with customers. If they do have Office 365, that means they have Azure AD. That means we're already federated with them. We could also have many, many other single sign-on scenarios. And this list here is all the other types of direct federations that we can do with Google and Facebook, and we do direct federation with SAML and WSFed as well. And then the catch-all is that if you don't fit into any of those other buckets, we can use a one-time passcode. So if you have an email address, it doesn't matter where it's hosted, where it's going, we can on-prem, we can work with you and have a secure and governed experience. The other one that is a great topic we're just not talking about today is what's called B2B Direct Connect, and is used with team shared channels. So keep your eyes and ears out for sessions at Ignite. Always exciting announcements around that topic as well as the B2B collaboration. So we're going to be up here today as we go through this session. The first piece we'll get into are really around the guest governance patterns that we've seen with customers. And we've basically been able to put these in 3 different buckets. The first one we call loosely governed, which is really the default if you use Office 365 and Teams, where you go inside of Teams and you can invite people in, and it's all self-service. And moderately governed is really getting into the concept of, well, we want to bring guests in, but we want to be very selective of how we do it. There's some teams that we do not want guests, and there's some that we want to allow guests. And then a subset of that is inside of that, we want to be able to leverage the customer's domain, their email domain, and say, can we kind of use that as an allow and deny list as well? And Mike's going to go into detail on all of these. So this is very, very high level. And then the last piece around highly governed is really leveraging entitlement management, where there's manual options where you can just set these things up manually, but we'll show you that after a while, that becomes a lot of work, and we need to look at an automated solution as we go through. Let's dig into loosely governed first, just to cover to make sure that we know we're all on the same page. Again, I'll bring up a scenario where we have 3 tenants, and we'll say, in this case, we have a new employee in tenant A, and they've reached out to people in tenant B and C, and they want to be able to collaborate them. So they'll go inside of Teams, they invite them in to the team that they created. That will bring them back into this tenant, and they'll be able to collaborate here on the nice little mini Teams picture that we have. So really simple, no infrastructure, that's the default. And you can start layering lots of different governance around that as we go through. But the big difference there is that the person on the business side, who's the owner of the team, controls really just about everything, in the sense that they can invite anyone they want, they can invite people, create a new team, invite people in, and it's really self-governed by the business side. We have a little chart here to keep kind of scorecard, and it's not good or bad. There's different options for different customers. So it's not, loosely governed is not a bad thing. It's what fits your business model that you have. So in this case, what we'll say is it doesn't require IT. So what do I mean by that? We always need the key people in IT to configure, get these things initially set up. When we say it doesn't have a checkbox or requires IT, that means that anytime, let's say Mike needs to go to create a team or invite guests in, he doesn't need to reach out to someone in IT. We don't have a manual process in place to handle that either, is another example. So that's a good thing. IT is basically set up a self-service environment. So that's why we have a check mark here that it's a viral self-serve type of experience, and that it applies to all team channels. And what do I mean by that? Kind of the standard team channel, and then the private team channel is really what we mean by all. We're not going to talk about shared team channels today. And then under guest governance, there's a lot of things you can do, layer on some good things here, but what won't change is essentially that business user is in the driver's seat of adding guests in or not. And so in a highly regulated environment, we don't see this implemented a lot. We see it implemented in a lot of other environments. So let's head over to that. Let's go over starting with moderately governed asset access. And we break those down into selective teams, which ones can have it, guest access or not, and then what filtering can we do on the domains that are coming in as well. And so what that looks like, there's the few key pieces to that, and I want to kind of jump over to what that looks like. The first one is one of the controls that we can put in are information labels or sensitivity labels. So if I jump over here, this is inside of the Purview console, and I have a list of all the different labels that I have. And these labels can be applied directly to a team, and that basically enacts a policy. So if I bring this existing policy up, and let me kind of move forward to the section that I'm interested in. There's a ton of content here. We could do an entire session just on this. But if I jump down to here under privacy and external access, if I put this label on a team, what does that mean? And it means the part I'm interested in is this right here, is that if it's selected, then we'll let group owners of that team allow bringing guests from the outside. So if it's selected, people can bring guests in. If I come in here and say no to that, then all of a sudden guests can't come in. So that's a great way to add an additional layer of governance over the team. But the one challenge that customers have brought to us is if I jump over to an actual team that we already created, over here I'm looking at an Ignite walkthrough team that I created. And in this case, Hester Hyde is the owner. You can see here in the middle, so it's listed here. And there's one guest in it. Now, if I come down here, Hester Hyde being the owner, he has the capability to come in to look at the sensitivity label, but also change it. So let's say confidential was set to actually block external guests. And we said IT is a process that puts that on there. That's fine. But the issue that the customers we work with have is that the owner of the team can then come in and change that and say, let's make it public, and hit done. And now all of a sudden we're allowing guests in where maybe we wouldn't want guests to be in there. And so the bottom line with that process, we can't control who and where guests are allowed. And so that's why the security teams, identity teams say, no, we need to stop and not allow that. So Mike, that's a huge issue. How have we figured out to work with customers on that?
So as we're talking about these different scenarios today, and we kind of landed on, Todd and myself, the whole low, medium, high kind of thing, low governance, medium, moderate governance, high levels of governance, right? The assumption there is, how much touch do we have across those scenarios? And the examples we're calling out today are just some of the ways that you could, leveraging our services, perform whatever levels of governance you're looking to do. By all means, are we saying these are the only ways to do things? For example, some customers are perfectly fine with leveraging the label side, right? They're totally cool with trusting the owner to know what they're doing, how they're doing it, rock on, right? But there are other customers that are like, you know what, I'd like a little bit more, I'm not trying not to use the word control. I'd like a little bit more governance, a little bit more awareness around, for this example, how guests can come into my team. So what you're looking at here is teams in another tenant that I have up and running. And one of the ways to provide that additional level of governance is during the actual request and provisioning process, right? So I'm not necessarily want to walk through the entirety here and create a team. What I do want to kind of call out though is this bottom left here where you see allow guests, right? I can have as part of my provisioning requests, the ability to say, I would like this specific team to have guests in or not. Folks that are familiar with guest access and how you set this up in teams, think of it as the old school circuit breaker in your garage when all the power is coming in the house. The main power switch is what Teams is inside of the Teams admin center. The individual circuit breakers inside your circuit panel are the individual teams. And the challenge is, how do we get to that? Well, in using a combination of, in this case, a Power App, along with Power Automate and Microsoft Graph, I can get the exact setting inside of the Microsoft 365 group that says, allow or deny guests coming in. So what we do here is we leverage an intake mechanism, a setting here, and then when we provision this, we call the relevant endpoint and say, allow to add guests true or allow to add guests false. This results in, obviously, individual teams, but when we start looking at what we want to do and how we want to do it, if I go down to this team here, Team SEC Internal, and say, add member, and let's just put in, a Hotmail address, right? I'm not going to be allowed to add a guest because this specific team was created and provisioned and said, no guests allowed, right? So not happening. So if I look at my other team here, SEC External, and say add member, I can put in the same address. And now I'm allowed to add a guest from this perspective, right? So from a governance perspective, what we're saying is not all teams are allowed by default to add a guest in or not. You can make it part of your provisioning process to say on or off, and then based upon that, go through a more rigorous approval process, go through a more rigorous approval chain to see why you want to do that or not, and provide different rules and regulations for those teams. The net is I can create a team with guests allowed in or not in that instance. So that's kind of one way to what we've been calling moderately governed guests coming in.
And so just to recap, that capability is, at least for the customers we've been working with, huge, that they want that flexibility. And even though you're showing Power Automate, Mike, as the front end, but technically if someone was, let's say, using ServiceNow as their portal, they could use that as the place to request and do this. But the reality is it still will probably hook into Power Automate to get the work done.
Definitely, because we're using Graph under the scenes to make those individual settings valued true or false.
Got it.
Right.
Right.
So the other scenario I want to kind of show off real quick is, that's cool. We're okay with just bringing guests in, but another request we've also heard of from numerous folks is, I like guests coming in, but I only want certain guests coming in from certain organizations, right? I don't want the entirety of the world to come into my team, which I could have done in the prior example. I want a specific set of businesses that I work with to only be allowed to come into this team. So for example, if I'm trying to add an individual to this team, and I just got to try and type Hotmail here. Let me spell my name correctly, at hotmail.com. Again, we've closed this door. I'm not allowed to add a guest in through what I'm going to call the normal method, right? But leveraging, again, Power Platform, underlying Power Automate and Microsoft Graph, I can now put in a request and provision a guest to come in here. So if I was to put in my name, put in that email address again, and then tab off, notice to the right-hand side how that says email is invalid. If I tab off right away, note how it went valid. That's cool because right here, it looks like it's a relatively standard looking email address, right? It looks properly formed, fully qualified domain, etc. But if I was to change that domain, still looks like a valid email address, but now it says this is invalid. How did that happen, right? So if you look at some of the underpinnings of this specific solution, we're leveraging what's called an allow domain list that you can see here, and it lists off a number of different domains. Leveraging these services, in this specific instance, we're actually surfacing the underlying SharePoint site of a Microsoft team and using that site's allow domain list. So if you look at the domains here on the back end inside of SharePoint Admin Center for that specific team, guest test, there's my list of domains that now allow me to control who can come in. So rather than reinvent the wheel, we're saying, you know what, grab me those domains, open that up on the Power Automate, Power Platform side of the fence, spin me up another app in this instance so that whenever I want to add an email, as long as it matches what my SharePoint said on the back end, I'm letting them in, right? So I'm not having multiple lists to kind of govern who's coming in or not. I'm saying in this instance, use the list that I already have, use the list from my underlying SharePoint site, bubble that up for the individuals who are trying to bring folks in, and use that as my business rules accordingly. So the notion of moderate governance, as we've been kind of discussing, is really how do I tweak it so there's a little bit of gates in the process of not necessarily individual who, but what domains, or if companies are okay with it, just have guests on at a team at a selected level. So.
Yeah, and I love that feature because there's several layers already that exist to control domains coming in and out. So like under Azure Active Directory, there's external identities, and you can add domains inside of there of who's allowed. But that's one of those big levers, right? There's several big levers to say, hey, if you're on the deny list, then you're not getting in any new guest users at all, which is good. That's what that does. And then there's one in Teams, and there's a few other places. But this is nice because you can say, look, I just want to say allow them in, but only to this exact team. And there's no other capability that does that. And the good news is they all do something different. So usually when we do these sessions, It's walking through it, a lot of discussion on what their business process is, and then what the governance requirements are.
And a lot of this will also kind of, stir the creative juices in terms of, I didn't think about it that way.
Right.
Now let's think about how else we could theoretically monitor, govern, et cetera, people coming into my organization, right? Because it's not just these ways, but having examples of these that are relatively concrete and walking through them will allow some customers to go, I didn't think about it that way. Let me kind of, think about it some other way else. So,
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks.
you're welcome.
So let's go back to our kind of scorecard chart that we're having here of just, hey, what the options are. And so back to kind of the moderately governed, the B2B guest piece, we'll kind of build this out and say, what does this compare to the first option that we have? So this is viral and self-serve because we're, in this case, leveraging Power, the whole Power platform really under Power Automate to make this self-serve. So the good check mark there. The business does not need to call IT at midnight and say, I need a team because the merger started and we need to get this going. So that's good news. We'll go over here on the right-hand side. Applies to all team channels again. Standard and private is how we define that, which is good. And then we put the MTC logo here because really the discussion that we just had, as simple as it was, usually there's a lot of people, different teams in the room, and we need to get everyone's thoughts and concerns and goals on the table and make sure that we're walking through all of them. So that's where this is not just a quick download this and run with it. It's really more of a consulting conversation of how do you want this to run. So the answer is we can do that and we can do a lot more, and it's really more of a custom solution for the customer as we go through. And then my quick visual is, hey, this team, maybe we allow guests, yes, but in this team, yes for guests, but the others, no. And that's, again, one of the examples, unique capability. And then even when we get to another piece that Mike showed around the guest is inside this guest, say, yes, we'll allow it, but only for a given domain as well. So you're kind of like 2 levels of control that we added to that mix. All right, great. So the next piece is around what we call highly governed. And that all these terms could mean a lot of different things. So we'll try to just define what our terms mean here for you today. Really, one of the key pieces is the life cycle. So it's one thing to bring a guest user in, which what we've talked about so far is fairly easy to do, and get them collaborating and have the right controls in place. Then we need to start look a little bit further out and say, when do these guests need to leave? Whether it's part of a defined contract with a date on it or some other event that occurs, when do they actually leave? And leave could mean lose their access to the team. And then it also means actually leave Azure Active Directory so the account doesn't exist anymore. So that's that's what we're defining for today as highly governed as we go through that. So how do we achieve that? We use entitlement management inside of Azure Active Directory to achieve those goals. It also helps us to govern to really drive this collaboration at scale. So again, if we're adding 1 or 2 people in at a time, you don't really need to think about this usually as much. But if you start thinking about, again, 100, 1,000 people, maybe more as part of a really large organizational change, you need another way to do it. So the highly governed piece, the first part I'll walk through is a brief walkthrough what entitlement management looks like, kind of a hierarchy view of it. And then Mike will dig into how do you automate that and really achieve that goal. So in this case, just one last example, I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see. Inside of this team, just one example that we'll use is, let's say we have a team here and a team here and a team here, and we want to give access to all 3 of those at once when we bring in one person. So this nice person right here. And so that's, again, fairly easy to do, one person. But if it's 10, 100, 1,000 or bigger than that, how do we do that really kind of a template approach and scale it really easy and also remove those rights as well. So that's really a real quick visual on what it looks like. From kind of a whiteboard perspective, we'll start with good old Contoso. On the right-hand side, that's that represents the organization that is going to be inviting these people in, meaning the guest. On the left-hand side, we have Woodgrove Bank, so they'll represent the people that are actually headed over here like this. And then just if you haven't worked with entitlement management, this will be a very brief discussion on what it is, and then we're going to give you a reference to a great session at this Ignite that digs into it more. So one of the first concepts is you need what's called a connected org. So that is, again, you're going to use a domain name to define what organization is allowed to come in. And it's really based on at a high level, say the email domain name to keep it simple for today. So we enter that into on the Contoso side and say, now we're more or less going to start trusting people to come over and request access, specifically from only Woodgrove Bank. Then we have this concept of a catalog where it allows us to put all the resources that we might want to offer. They're not all the ones we want to offer, but they're at least the ones that are candidates. So it could be all the team sites, the SharePoint sites, the applications that are integrated with Azure AD are all the current resources that we can provide today. Those essentially get put in different access packages. And so it could be a mix of different resources that you have, or we found out from a lot of experience with customers on another approach, which I'll let Mike talk to keep things simple, especially when it comes to automation. And so what we're looking at here is these are some of the resources that we can provide access to as part of what, I'll call it a high level of template. And then we also define an internal sponsor. So this could be one, ideally more than one person who, if requests come in this case, we'll call it Megan B, that she will actually say yes or no on their approval to let these people in. And again, we would ideally want more than one person to be on that list. The last piece to this, at least at the high level, is when we created this whole construct, we get what's called a My Access portal link. That is something we can ship over through email, any way we want to communicate through Teams to the Woodgrove Bank side. And then they can distribute that to the people that they want to have request access to the access packages we've created. On the left-hand side, it's optional that you could have an external sponsor. In this case, it could be Bob. And what that would mean is as Woodgrove Bank, we might have thousands and tens of thousands of users. Instead of having all of the initial requests come right over to Megan and Megan's hands getting very tired approving or disapproving of those requests, what can happen is the first line of those requests in one scenario would be they first go through Bob, and Bob can be the filter and say, well, really, there's 100 requests here. Really, we only need 10 of those to go over to Megan, and he acts as that first line of control in there. All right, so let's build it out a little bit more. So that initial part is kind of the initial configuration. Now, actually assigning the resources to people, we kind of initially discussed with customers a hierarchy view of this, and that's just because we often work in hierarchies. And that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. It's just a way to start. And then we've had customers come with amazing scenarios that have nothing to do with a hierarchy, and it all works entirely. So it's great. So, but for this, we'll keep it straightforward for this example. So we're going to take that same concept of the connected org that we saw up here. We'll now say we're down here. And now from a hierarchy standpoint, we're going to take that catalog and start with that. And then we'll say, here are all those resources that we have, again, Teams, SharePoint, Azure AD apps, et cetera. And then from there, we'll start saying, hey, we'll put some in here, we'll put some in here, and we'll call those access packages. And then that's where, again, the list of resources that we can have, and then they'll get the portal link, there'll be a sponsor, and then there's also roles that will be defined in here that you'll see. I'll show an example. So if you have a team, one of these guests that are coming in down here could actually be the owner of the team. You may or may not want that, so maybe we'll just make them a member as well. Let's look at an example of how we can do that. And the last comment that we'll have on here before we jump over is we want to take care of the life cycle of that as well. So when does all this end? It's good to get it enabled, but when do we actually pull away and remove access and the users from Azure AD? I'm inside of Identity Governance inside of Azure Active Directory here inside the Entra console, and I'm just going to look right at the connected organizations. Here is the Woodgrove Bank one that I pre-created. And essentially what we're seeing here is that I have a directory and domain. There's Woodgrove right there. And it actually, we always like to talk about this, is when you type that domain name in, you'll look down here and see that it says that domain is going to leverage a one-time passcode. What that means is when someone from Woodgrove tries to authenticate in, we'll have their email address, we'll send them a one-time passcode. That's how they'll authenticate. We can add other layers, strong authentication, other things as well, but this is the first one that we work with. If I typed in Microsoft.com up here and looked at it, the authentication type would actually be Azure AD. which means they're already, essentially federated in because all the tenants are owned by Microsoft, and they'll essentially get single sign-on. They won't get a one-time passcode. So those are the two options that come out of here, and then also the sponsors are listed under here as well. That's a really quick overview of what a connected org is. On the catalog side, kind of going through that hierarchy, here I define the catalog. If I jump into that, I'm able to dig into this and see what the resources are. And what you see here are all the different resources that I said are possible ones that we could use. So you see groups and teams, applications, and SharePoint sites right here. And then I'm going to go one level deeper into the access packages. So here I created one for the finance department, and I'll bring up that. And essentially, if I look into that a little bit, I'll get a list of it looks similar to the other list, but it actually has less things in it. These are the actual resources that I've defined. And if I go over here on the right-hand side, you can also see the roles that I've defined. So for the team, that's a member. For an application, I have a user. And then these are SharePoint sites here that are defined as communication site visitors, and the one's a viewer for one of the community sites that we had. That's kind of some of the details that we had. And then the last piece that I'll show here is around the life cycle, because that's huge. That's one of the things that we always called out earlier. And if we look here, there's several options for life cycle. One is you could define a specific date, as I did here, when this would expire. So that's perfect for a contract or some other known end time. So you say, look, this is good. We're going to give you all this access. We're going to give you access to all these different resources. On that date is where we're going to pull them away. We had a conversation before this session today about, hey, what do people get notified, Mike, of when this date occurs?
Yeah, they get emails 2 weeks out and a day out.
All right. So what if they don't read those emails?
If they don't read those emails and the certain settings are set up that way, then they may lose access to the resources that they have access to at that point in time.
Right. And so it's good to call that out because, as we know, everyone's super busy and may not be able to look at that. So one additional option you have in here is people can extend their access, but they have to at least know that they're possibly losing access to extend it. So the worst case scenarios, they'll lose access and we can go back in and re-add them. It could be, hopefully it's not worse than that as far as their pain point that they have, but it's not hard to give them back the entitlements that they had. We can also define it by number of days and down to even hours. And if it's a really interesting situation, maybe it never expires and you'll expire it out on some other time frame. So that's at least the one piece I wanted to show. And as quickly, as intentionally as I went through this, there was a lot of clicks and it still took several minutes to go through. And this was a pre-created one. So one thing that we changed the discussion with customers after we show this and show the power of it is, how do you do this at scale? Because if I'm taking requests maybe from the business and they say, oh, we're going to have we have an organization, these are the people, we need these packages set up. You send it to me, I can go as fast as I can and then do another one and another one. And that doesn't really scale well. And at least some of us try to sleep sometimes, right? At least get a few hours in. So Mike, what could I do? How could I handle this in a better way to make this scalable, repeatable?
So Ellen, a little more information as it relates to that setup, because everything that Todd was walking through and showing off is available right away through your portal, right? There's nothing magic about that. There's nothing funky that I'm doing, right? I'm walking through my identity governance sections out of Entra. I'm setting up my organizations. I'm setting up my catalogs, resources, et cetera. We mapped it out a few weeks ago in terms of how do I do this baseline for a new org hitting a new team. And it was in excess of 30 steps to go through the entirety of the process, right?
That assumes you did it right.
And that assumes you did it right, right? So now we start talking about scale, right? Because if you're an organization that has a lot of work with a lot of folks that are outside of your organization, which is pretty much every organization that I know of, right? There's a little bit of a challenge, because if you don't start thinking about how to, what I'm going to say, properly scale, as i.e. handle it, that turns into your day job, right? And you have a lot more other work to happen than to create connected orgs and such all day, right? So part of what I want to show you here is yet another way of leveraging the services and capabilities in the cloud, specifically, again, Power Platform, Power Automate, Microsoft Graph to the relevant endpoints, to spin up everything that Todd was just talking about automatically, right? So if I kind of look at inside of my identity governance portal and I go to connected organizations, and I'll make this a little bit bigger real quick, I just see these three here, right? So I want to bring in an individual who's outside of my org into this specific team that I'm in. And I can do the same thing as before. I can theoretically just spin up another application, fill in the relevant field and say, let's just have edit. But I can also, either stick down the PVA path or a bot path or whatever, where I just say, I want to add a guest. And then what'll happen is, as I go off and do the rest of my workday, right? Since we're controlling the method in, we've locked the earlier door. I didn't show you again. I tried to add a member with a guest address. They're not gonna be able to get in. But with leveraging the things that I just talked about earlier, I'm able to then kick off processes that say, wait a second, you just wanted to add a guest to that individual team. Note here how it knows what team I'm already involved with asking, so it's contextually aware. And now I'm gonna put in the individual guest's name. So I can put in their details here, and let me get his email over here, copy that guy, paste it over here, put in the phone number, and then we'll give him a company name. We'll do the same thing and just delete a few things. And once this starts rolling, the intent here is to say, you know what? I have a guest coming in. This is who I want to add to the team. I'm going to submit it. And now I'm going to go off and do other work that I'm doing today, right? So I'm going to go back to my team, do some other work and so on while that process is in flight, right? So while that process is in flight, there may be workflows that are kicked off. There may be other ways to kind of save a lot of that data in terms of saving the state. But in the next part of this example, what I'll get back is kind of like a courtesy notification is, hey, you just did this and this is who you would try to invite in, right? So if I kind of look at the actual information coming back, I see validation of what I just entered. So I'm looking to add a guest to that specific team that I was just in, the guest's name, the individual guest's email address, right? And that's awesome. I'm using an adaptive card in this instance. I'm kind of formatting the information a little bit nicer, right? So at least it's consistently how I'm reading it. It's consistent across the board. And then now if I look at this activity, now this viewpoint here is as if I am the individual team owner. So in this instance, we're not just saying, hey, let's bring guests in. We're saying, hey, guests are coming in, but the first gate in this instance is the owner of the team, right? Because while anybody could theoretically bring a guest in, somebody's got to say before all that other stuff that Todd was talking about happening, saying, is that cool or not, right? So in this instance, because the team owner said, we're all cool with that, we're going to put in a little thumbs up, and then we're going to say approve, right? So once that happens, back to the view of the original requester, I will also get additional telemetry and notification that says, hey, your request was approved. Again, here's my adaptive card. I can play with colors, I can play with emojis, could do a lot kind of funny stuff. But again, I'm seeing what team I'm playing with, who was invited, who actually invited, or in this case, approved them. I can actually mouse over and find out more details of who the approver was. I can reach out to them via chat message or call them up from here, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm always aware as the team guest initiator of what's going on, right? Now let's look at the security view of this, right? So Chris Green here, who the persona is I'm logged on as, is the individual that owns the identity governance side of Azure Active Directory, right? So totally separate set of personas that we've been talking with, right? So in this instance, Chris is going to get an approval request because that domain that we were looking to add, M365X, et cetera, wasn't on the original connected organizations list, but it needs to get on the list because that's the beginning of our process, right? So from this perspective, Chris can just put in his comments and I'll just say, again, thumbs up, right? I'll say approve. And once that goes through, back to the original requester, they'll get information, and I deliberately didn't use an adaptive card here so you can see the difference. If I was just to use a normal post a message in Teams, I can get a little bit fancy with the bolding and stuff, but if I want like nice consistency and things of that nature, adaptive cards are a way to go. Now, what does this all mean? Now behind the scenes, it's spinning up all of the underlying, call them objects, call them items in relation to the connected organizations, the catalogs, the resource that I'm trying to get access to, specifically the theme that I was in. Scaffold all that up, ultimately resulting in an access package link that then gets sent to the individual that we just invited, in this case, Alex, right? So while this is happening, all the stuff behind the scenes after the fact of all the approval steps are now spinning up all those objects. So if I go over to my identity governance section and I refresh my page, There's the organization I was just talking about. That's the one that just got added by our process. If I look at the individual catalog, I now have a new catalog with the same organization name, and I'll get into that in a second. Inside this catalog is a bunch of different resources and packaged. Technically, only one resource, one access package for today's conversation. If I look at the resource is the actual team that I kicked all this off, right? So again, contextual awareness from the capabilities that I have allows me to not ask for all this stuff all over again, thereby making it just approve or reject, right? The net of this is I've created an access package with a specific URL to my access portal that I then sent to Alex because he's now going to come into the team, right? Up until this point, all the scaffolding and creation of these relevant objects here are done by Power Automate Microsoft Graph. The second that Alex clicks that click here link, he goes to the My Access portal. I'll ask me to log in again. And I'm not going to go through all this because this will take a few minutes to do so. But what will happen is this now kicks off the out-of-the-box access package approve, reject, review process that folks should already be familiar with from an entitlement management perspective. Folks that are going to either attended or we'll look at Al Early's second part of the session that was done earlier. He goes through in detail specifically the approved processes around entitlement management and access packages. But what we're doing here is spinning up all of the objects behind the scenes so that at the end of the day, I'm not the one creating them by hand all the time, all day, right? Also inclusive of our user lifecycle management. So whether it's 365 days, 30 days, the whole 9 yards, all of that can be configured inside of my workflows to spin that up automatically, and I'm not having to worry about them manually being created.
Yeah, this is so powerful because we use this as an example with customers, and then they go in whatever direction, many different directions that make sense for them. What it does, though, is it puts their business users in a position where, as long as they have access to Teams, they can get this started. It also lets the people, and whoever's going to do the approvals, just needs to have a mobile device, just click yes or approve, and the rest happens in the background. So the automation is extremely powerful. And this is just one example on how to do it. There's so many directions that we've taken with customers. That's awesome, Mike. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And again, we need to make sure you see Al Early's session from the London MTC, because he then goes into good depth on the approval process right where Mike left off. So please take a look at that once the recording is available. So to recap, there's two things that we went through. One is both it's a highly governed scenario, one with entitlement management, one I walk through, which is kind of the manual process. You know, what does our scorecard look with there? One is it requires IT. We're all IT pros here. The difference is this requires IT to go and create everything manually. And that's not what we want to do. We want to move to a different model. However, it has great guest governance, again, a full life cycle of the permissioning and handling of the account. And again, applies all the team channels that we talked about. Mike just went through how to do this at scale. Let's bring in automation. Let's really customize this for a customer scenario. So now guess what? IT's done the work. They've done the enablement. So if anything, let's give them a smiley face. And then that solution they created is what makes this viral and self-serve for the business. Also maybe for IT as well. And again, check mark here and check mark here, we're good to go with all of those. Whatever works for you, that's the one you picked. And sometimes it's a mix of these solutions that we go through. So we basically have a minute or two, Mike, to wrap up. In summary, just go with what makes sense. And if what makes sense is keeping guests disabled, then let's engage. Please engage with the Microsoft Technology Centers around the globe. Love to work with you. This is a classic, what we call cross-solution workload, where it's collaboration with teams, it's Power Automate, it's security. We didn't even get into the data, data protection, the privacy. All those pieces are part of that solution, which is why often it's a day and maybe 2 days to really get through this with all the different aspects of it.
And it's a really good point, because a lot of the examples we showed off here were actually gen from conversations with customers like yourself, right? So by all no means are these the only ones, right? There are other ways to make this thing move forward in whatever manner meets your needs. Just note, through the usage of Power Automate, Power Platform overall, reaching out to the relevant endpoints of Microsoft Graph, you can pretty much do all the things you need to do from an automated perspective than you would have to do manually. So let's kind of take a look at the chat and see what we got here before we have a minute or two to go. So Deb had a question I answered in the chat real quick. Another question from Charter. Are there plans to allow team admins to apply custom teams policies to guest accounts? Currently, the guest accounts get applied to the global policy, and we cannot specify a different policy. I know we can create CA policies that target guests specifically, not like individual branch guests. What I would suggest is look at the other identity sessions throughout Ignite yesterday, today, tomorrow for additional information around that. But I do know you can create CA policies targeted to all the guests.
Right, yeah, look for some announcements this week.
Does this solution approach integrate with Purview in any way?
So Purview is the whole compliance story. So the answer is yes. We didn't cover any of it except for then the sensitivity labels.
Another question is, does this, did I get this right to specify allowed domains per site collection team? How does this scale? So what we've seen with some customers, they actually hit the upper limit when they use the allowed domain list. But when you go down the entitlement management path, you can add as many connected organizations as you want. You can create all the different policies you want. So we haven't hit that upper limit as of yet in terms of our conversations with customers. But we've seen people start to go down that path instead of just the list.
Right, yeah.
We have an automated script that checks guest account for inactivity. Currently, it is configured for 90 days. If the account has no activity, we delete them. If you leverage the user lifecycle management policies inside of entitlement management, it handles all of that. You'll set up the window of opportunity for review.
Right.
And you'll also set up what happens when you do approve, when they reject, or even if they do not respond. If they do not respond, you can elect to do nothing, kick them out, or do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, but it's a good call out that sometimes it's good to take multiple approaches to guest accounts just because there's other scenarios definitely that get covered. So
can you only request a guest member from that one team via chat that is being allowed to have guests added to it, i.e. your external team? I'd have to kind of go into a little bit more of the question.
I think one thing that could mean is you went through that process for one user. What if you need to add other users?
Right, so
sure, that's it. But
if the second user was from the same domain or organization, none of that stuff would need to be spun up. It was already there. If I added a different user from a different organization to that team, in this instance, I'd probably go through the entirety of the process, add a new connected org, create a new catalog, put that same team in a different catalog, because now it applies to both, and spin up a separate access package. To Todd's earlier point, you can create one access package to rule them all. Not necessarily as flexible as you like, because you have multiple organizations everywhere else inside one package. If you go down the path of multiple access package, one per domain as an example, you can have theoretically a lot more access packages to manage. But to me, that allows for a lot more granular security than one big access package. And that sounds it. Rich, thanks for putting in Al's question. Very end. How is this different from access review policy for guest users? Awesome. So the access review policy kind of came into the tail end. This kind of links both the review process with the actual entitlement and access of the actual resource.
Yeah, so great question. Access review policies, you could probably put them anywhere in this process, definitely loosely and moderately scenarios, you could put them in there. And then to Mike's point, inside of entitlement management, access reviews are actually integrated there as well. So that's why there isn't one. What we showed are just really good ideas from customers, and then we customize it all. So access reviews, sometimes we go down a whole path of just using those for certain groups.
And then Savil's got a question. Does this address Teams federation with boundaries and limit where vendors can go and communicate with? There's still in preview, we can talk about it, XTAP policies, right? So cross-tenant access policies. So look up identity sessions here at Ignite, look into the cross-tenant access policy stuff. That'll address that specific scenario, so you can control right away who can go out and who can come in at a super high level.
Yeah,
right?
Call out.
How do you get rid of old guests from your Azure Active Directory? So one of the settings we didn't show inside of Identity Governance, if those guests get removed via lifecycle and they've been removed from all of the resources that they were given access to through those access packages, if they wind up that they're in nothing now, Identity Governance can be configured to actually remove them from Azure AD. So you don't have any floating guests around that are orphaned from doing anything else. Right?
And reviews have a role in that as well. So that's why we talk to customers.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to entitlement management. Awesome set of solutions.
Yeah.
But we recognize that there's a lot of moving parts, which is why from a scalability perspective, it makes it really tough to handle. So when you throw in some automation equates to scale. Everybody's happy when that starts spinning up and spinning down.
Awesome. Great job.
Folks, thanks for joining. Appreciate you hanging out. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, night, afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your night. Take care.
Thank you.